I was born a free man, lived with my family in New York.
Be good for your mother.
Until the day I was deceived.
To Solomon.
Kidnapped. Sold into slavery.
That's scripture. The condition of your laborers, it's all wrong.
And my property.
You say that with pride.
I say it as fact.
Speak!
Man does how he pleases with his property.
You come here.
I say come here!
Days ago, I was with my family, in my home. Now you tell me all is lost.
If you want to survive, do and say as little as possible.
It's based on a true story. In the first shots, we see men and women engaged in harvesting cane on the plantation. They go to sleep on the floor at night and eat breakfast in the morning. Among them is Solomon Northup. He had made a quill and ink out of what was available, and at night he wanted to write a letter, but the ink was too liquid. As everyone fell asleep, he began to remember his wife. Further events take us back in time. Solomon Northup is a free black man, a musician. He performs at ceremonial events. 2 small children and his beloved wife were waiting for him at home. She is going to leave for 3 weeks to earn money. The woman is a good cook. In the morning she set off. It was the year 1841. Solomon was accosted by a white gentleman who introduced him to 2 of his friends. Mr. Brown and Mr. Hamilton were interested in Solomon's musical talents and offered him a job. Solomon agreed and went with Brown and Hamilton to Washington. After the successful event, the gentleman invited Solomon to celebrate at a restaurant. He woke up on the bare floor and in chains. Solomon remembered how ill he had felt after his drink. Then Brown and Hamilton took him somewhere and put him to bed. In the present, white men came to Solomon's cell. Solomon assured them that he was a free man from Saratoga, but the slave trader mistook him for a runaway slave from Georgia. As punishment, Solomon was beaten. When the slave traders left, Solomon tried to call for help.
Somebody help!
But no one here heard him. Soon clean clothes were brought to him. He refused to eat. Solomon was sure Brown and Hamilton would come back for him, but Clemens and John assured him that the 2 gentlemen had apparently sold him. Now the slaves would be transported south to the slave state and put up for sale. Randall's mother and sister came for him. They too were locked up here by fraudulent means. The owners threatened the slaves, telling them they must not make a sound while they were being transported. First they were transported in a cart, and then they were taken to the ship. Another slave advised Solomon not to tell anyone that he could read and write. That is the only way to survive here. Solomon, Clemens, and John decide to revolt and take over the ship. The rest of the men who are here were born slaves and know no other life, so they will not agree to participate in the rebellion. When a member of the crew woke Eliza up, intending to take her with him, the rioters began to act, but John was immediately stripped of his life and thrown overboard. Solomon realized he could not get out. At the port, Clemens was picked up by his former owner. Clemens was so happy that he threw himself into his arms. Solomon and the other slaves were put up for sale. There was also a slave named Jasper. Solomon remembers going into the store with his wife. Jasper also went in and was almost immediately taken away by his owner. In the present, the slaves were counted. Solomon was now called Platt.
Your name is Platt.
The slaves were loaded on a cart and taken to another place where they were brought to marketable condition. Soon rich gentlemen came to buy slaves. Among the nobles was William Ford, who wanted to buy Platt and Eliza. Realizing that she would never see her children, Eliza became hysterical. To calm everyone down, Platt played the violin. Soon he and the weeping Eliza were brought to the Ford family mansion. Upon learning that Eliza was separated from her children, Mr. Ford's wife seemed to feel sympathy for her. The Lord told the overseer Mr. Chapin to take care of the man and woman and to take them to the plantation tomorrow. John Tibiats, William Ford's chief carpenter, ordered them to call him Lord and clap their hands. During the day the slaves did hard labor, and during breaks William Ford read a prayer in front of them. When work resumed, Platt advised Mr. Ford of a way to reduce consumption of transportation on the river. John ridiculed him, for he thought slaves were incapable of intellectual activity, but Mr. Ford disagreed. He told Platt to assemble a brigade and carry it out. Mr. Ford was impressed and even shook the slave's hand. Later, as a token of his gratitude, He gave him a violin. Meanwhile, Eliza had not stopped crying, missing her children. Platt advised her not to grieve their master, for Mr. Ford is a good man. It just so happens that he was born a slave owner. If they fell into despair, they surely would not survive. Nevertheless, this did not make Eliza stop crying. Soon Mrs. Ford was tired of listening to these sobs. John found fault with Platt for any reason. The carpenter hated the slave's disobedience. Suddenly Platt saw two men leading Eliza into the woods. He recalls how Eliza had previously told him about her former owner. He loved her very much. She lived in luxury. They had a daughter. But the master's eldest daughter hated her and the sister, so she did everything she could to get rid of them. John continued to anger Platt, who refused to comply. Unable to stand it, Platt attacked John and beat him. Chapin intervened and told Platt not to leave the plantation. Otherwise, he will not be able to protect him. John hurried to punish the slave, but again Chapin intervened, making it clear that Platt was not to be touched. To be more convincing, he drew a gun. While Chapin waited for Mr. Ford, Platt remained in a helpless state, none of the other slaves wanting to help him except the young girl who brought him water. Mr. Ford did not arrive until evening. He freed Platt and carried him to his house. Mr. Ford reported that Tibiats is hiding somewhere nearby and wants revenge. It is not safe for Platt to be here, which is why Mr. Ford intends to turn the slave over to his friend Edwin Epps. Platt tries to explain that he is not a slave, but a free man, but Ford cannot help him. According to him, Epps is a cruel man, but he is the only one who agreed to take an unruly slave. Edwin Epps is a very religious man who believes sacredly that slavery is approved by the Bible. He constantly repeats to his slaves that he does not tolerate insubordination. Platt and the other slaves picked cotton on the plantation, the overseers constantly supervising them. The young girl Patsy picked far more cotton than any of the men. The master was very pleased with her and called her the Queen of Fields. In her spare time, Patsy would weave dolls out of stems. Mary, Epps' wife, was watching. At night, Mr. Epps woke the slaves. He told Platt to play the violin and the others to dance. Suddenly the mistress threw a bottle at Patsy. She told her husband to sell her, but he was not going to indulge his wife and said he would rather get rid of her than Patsy. After her hard work on the plantation, Mary ordered Platt to go to the market and buy everything on the list. She noticed that Platt is smarter than the others and can read, and she didn't like that. She reminded Platt that he was no better than the other slaves. On the way, Platt decided to seize the moment and escape, but suddenly he ran into the wardens who were about to get rid of some slaves. This caused Platt to change his mind about escaping. He bought everything the mistress demanded. One day Mr. Epps sent Platt to Mr. Shaw to pick up Patsy. Mrs. Shaw was so kind as to offer him tea. Mrs. Shaw used to be a slave too, but when she married her lord, she became a mistress herself. Now she has to indulge her husband in everything. Patsy too has a special position with her master, and she should take advantage of it. Mr. Epps didn't like Platt talking to Patsy. He wanted to attack the slave and chased after him, but Platt runs much faster than he does. Epps fell in the dirt and quickly exhausted himself. The master asked Platt to help him up and attacked him again. Mary intervened. Upon learning from Platt that Patsy is the cause of the conflict, the jealous wife became enraged. At night Epps came for Patsy, doing to her what he should only do to his wife. The next day Platt went shopping again. On the way back, he decided to steal a piece of paper from the mistress so he could write a letter later. In the evening, Mary treated all the slaves to cookies. All except Patsy. Mary again began to convince her husband that this slave had no place in their home. In the wife's opinion, Epps had become weak because he stood up for his own slave. At night the girl woke Platt up and asked him for a favor. Patsy wants him to take her life because she can't stand all this anymore. Platt refused to do it because he did not want to take such a sin upon himself. Epps' plantation was ruined by the parasite cotton bollworm. Epps thinks it's God's punishment. It's the pagan slaves who are to blame. The master punishes them for it. Epps decided to give his slaves for the use of Judge Turner for a while in order to get money. It was here that Platt decided to try to make ink from berries. Judge Turner was very pleased with Platt's work. He invited him to play a violin at William Yarner's anniversary party in 3 weeks. Platt will be able to keep all the money he earned for personal use. At night, Platt scratched out the names of his wife and children on the violin. At the Jubilee Masquerade party, the guests were having fun and Platt played the violin. Soon it was time to return to the former owner. Beside Epps stood a little dark-skinned girl. Patsy was even more traumatized. The slaves set to work on the plantation. Patsy still worked the hardest. Armsby, a white man, grieved his lord by picking too little cotton. In the evening, Armsby told Platt that he used to be an overseer, but then he got addicted to whiskey and lost everything. Now Armsby wants to make some money and go home. At night, Platt took his savings, earned by playing the violin. He decided to give it to Armsby in exchange for a favor. He would have to leave a letter in the mailbox in town and never tell anyone about it. Armsby agreed to do so. They agreed to meet in 2 days. That same night, Platt wrote a letter, using the means at hand. Later, Mr. Epps came to check on the slaves. Platt immediately realized that Armsby had told him everything. Platt assured the master that it was not true because Armsby is a liar and a drunkard who wants to become an overseer again. For this purpose, he decided to make the master doubt his own slaves. Epps believed Platt. Later, he burned the letter. One of the slaves lost consciousness on the plantation. They tried to revive him, but in vain. The other slaves were instructed to bury him. The deceased was a very good man and always took care of the others. Employee Samuel Bass works for Mr. Epps. An argument ensues between employer and employee. According to Samuel, slavery is not a virtue, but the supreme evil. All men are equal before God, and someday men like Epps will pay for all their deeds. Of course, Epps disagreed with this opinion, for the slaves were his property. During the day, Epps could not find Patsy anywhere and questioned the other slave, but no one saw her. Epps thought Patsy had run away, but then he saw the girl walking from Mr. Shaw's plantation. This infuriated Epps. Platt tried to stand up for Patsy, but got hit for it. Patsy confesses that she went to Mrs. Shaw to ask her for soap, because Mary doesn't give her any. Patsy works harder than anyone else and all she wants to do is be clean. Epps decided to punish the girl for her willfulness. Mrs. Shaw came to take care of wounded Patsy. Looking at this, Platt could not hold back tears. He broke his fiddle. During the day, the slaves continued to work. Platt asked Samuel where he came from. He replied that he was from Canada. At one point, Platt confessed that he is not a slave. After hearing his story, Samuel was astonished. Despite his previous unfortunate experience, Platt turned to Samuel for help, asking him to write a letter. If Platt's family would send his documents, everyone would realize he was a free man. Samuel promised that he would do so. One day an officer of the law came to Mr. Epps' house and asked Platt what his real name is. Realizing he was a free man, the sheriff announced that Solomon was free. Epps tried to challenge this decision, but it was not in his power. Before leaving this place forever, Solomon hugged Patsy. He couldn't believe that 12 years of nightmare were behind him. Solomon was very nervous before meeting his family. Next to him was his faithful friend Mr. Parker. When Solomon entered the house, he saw his wife and his grown-up son and daughter.
I apologize.
Solomon could not hold back his tears. The daughter hugged her father. She had already married and given birth to a boy named Solomon. Now the family was reunited. Next, the voiceover tells us about the real Solomon Northup. He is one of the few people who has been able to find freedom from slavery. He took the people responsible for his kidnapping to court and also wrote the book 12 Years a Slave. Solomon devoted his entire life to helping